Okay, this is gonna be a video on fantasy. All right, so fantasy. What is fantasy? Basically, I'm gonna be now discussing like delusions, stuff that's not real. You know, fantasy. What is fantasy? Fantasy is something that's not real, not real in the material world. Something that's not tangible. That's not physically a part of our actual reality. You know what I mean? That's what I mean by fantasy. You know, like you picture, like you imagine, like let's just say imagine a flying dragon. You know, that would be fantasy, right? Because dragons are not real. They're not a part of our physical material world, right? You know, fantasy. It's so important that you understand the difference between fantasy and reality. It's very important that you understand this type of difference between fantasy and reality, because a lot of people are very, very, very delusional, right? They believe in fantasy. Basically, they believe in things that aren't real, right? That's kind of bizarre to me, right? I'm not even kidding. There's so many different types of people, so many different types of mentally ill people, and they believe in fantasies. They believe in things that aren't real, right? You know, fantasy. You have to understand the difference between fantasy and reality, and it's so important that you kind of develop your mental skills to kind of, you know, to kind of spot the difference in this regard. You know what I mean? Fantasy stuff that's not real. That's so bizarre. There's so many different types of mentally ill people out there, and they believe in things that aren't real. You know, I mentioned dragons. Obviously, we know that dragons aren't real because we can't sense them in our physical material world. There's never been any sort of proper documentation on dragons, on how they fly around, how they're actually real, and how they're not just imaginary creatures. Obviously, dragons are imaginary creatures. They're fantasy creatures. They're a fantasy that's been made up. Fantasy, you know, the human is so weird. We make up our own kind of we sometimes just kind of we imagine things that aren't real. So we take like fantasy sometimes too seriously. It's kind of very weird. Obviously, this is gonna be very controversial, but you know, this obviously ties into our religion, right? In like, to what extent is religion fantasy? It's just all imaginary. Basically, it's just imaginary nonsense. You know what I mean? In religion, what do we mean by imaginary nonsense? I mean, as in, like, you know, a lot of the world religions probably were just kind of, they might not have been reflecting reality. They could have just been basically they could have just been, I guess, figments of some prehistoric people's imaginations. You know, obviously fantasy versus reality. Like, you have to spot the difference between fantasy and reality. You know, religion could be all just fantasy and delusion. What do I mean by fantasy? Fantasy is not real, not a part of this physical material world. There's like, some fantasy just means it's so made up and nonsense. That's what basically what I'm trying to get at, right? Fantasy, you gotta develop your mental skills, and you have to be able to spot the difference between fantasy and reality. All right, so what's reality? Reality is the physical material world we're living in, right? Things that can be tested and proven, can be felt, can be seen, can be documented. That's what reality is. Fantasy is the complete opposite. It's completely fantasy is completely just all, I guess, made up nonsense. I guess it doesn't reflect the real life world. You know, dragons aren't a part of the real life world, right? Real life world. Not there. Obviously, you can see them on screens, in video games and cartoons and movies and stuff like this. Because, you know, the human, because we humans, we made it so that our imaginations can kind of materialize, because we can kind of fabricate and make up like toys, animations and stuff like this to kind of, which is kind of very magical. Like, we can literally bring things from our imagination into real life, obviously. But, you know, dragons, they're not naturally occurring beings and entities. They're not naturally alive, you know what I mean? They're not a part of the natural world. They're not real in that type of way. They're not as real as like a lion. You know, a lion is a natural creature, right? So it didn't come from the human imagination. A lion, you know, lions in the African savannah, they existed. I mean, maybe not, I don't know about their entire history, but, you know, they weren't just made up by us humans, right? They existed on their own, and we just encountered them, and now they're like, we kind of document them and record them and kind of include them in a lot of our movies and shows and whatever, and documentaries. But, you know, a lion is not a fantasy creature. It's not a lion. It's not like a dragon. You know, a dragon is a fantasy creature. It's something that was spawned from the human imagination. And, you know, there are so many different things in this world that were just spawned from the human imaginations. The human imagination. So many things that we feel are so real and true. They're just from our imagination. They're just spawned from our imagination. It's very it's very awe-inspiring. I don't know, it's very interesting that we can just bring things from our imagination into real life, and we can almost like pretend like it's actually real. Again, religion's so important because what are the chances a lot of the major world religions were just spawned from, they didn't reflect reality. They were just figments of some prehistoric people's imagination. They were just all fantasies. Fantasy versus reality. This is so important. You need to understand the difference between what's real and what's just all fantasy and made up and nonsense. Fantasy, dragons are not real. They've never been seen by a lot of people. Obviously, there's been a lot of accounts that talked about, like, maybe this creature could have been a dragon. Obviously, that's not the case. I mean, I'm talking about the modern age and stuff like that. The modern age, it's never been shown. It's never been shown. It's never been shown that dragons are real and stuff like that. It's never been shown that dragons are real, obviously, which is kind of interesting. I don't know. It's never been shown that dragons are real in that type of way. Like, a bunch of people have never kind of properly encountered a dragon before, ever, right? A bunch of people in the modern age, obviously. A bunch of people in the modern age have never encountered. I mean, in a modern age, we have phones. We have smartphones that can record videos in a very rich detail. We have so many cameras and so many different pieces of technology that can capture things so perfectly. Right? But it's never been discovered that dragons are real, and a bunch of different people have probably taken pictures of these dragons. Right? It's never been proven. Dragons are not real because obviously it's very obvious that they're not real. They're fantasy creatures. Obviously, they're fantasy, as in they're not a part of this physical material world. Dragons are not real at all, and that's they're a fantasy. They're a fantasy creature. They're fantasies. So many things in our world are just from our own imagination. They're not real. There you are, Nick. There you are, man. So many different things in our world come from our imagination. That's so weird and bizarre. Fantasy, you gotta understand that difference. The difference between fantasy and reality is so important. Again, reality, something that's real, a part of our real life world, a part of our real physical material world. Lions. There's tons of photographs of them, pictures of them, videos of them. So many different people kind of talk about them and see them and interact with them and can kind of discuss how they're like and stuff like this. This is how you know that lions are real. They're not just fantasy creatures. They're not like dragons. And there's no real photographic evidence or video evidence or any other type of meaningful evidence for the existence of dragons. Obviously, there's very maybe medieval accounts. Obviously, we know that that's just kind of delusional and nonsense. Dragons are not real. Medieval accounts, like these medieval people probably were just kind of making it all up and stuff. These medieval people probably were seeing things that weren't real. They probably had a bunch of different problems with their brain and their understandings, and their knowledge was kind of very flawed and stuff like this. Obviously, blah blah blah. In that regard, obviously, those types of medieval accounts on dragons, they're not very trustworthy and reliable. So anyway, I don't want to waste too much time on this, but fantasy versus reality is so important that you can spot the difference between what's fantasy and what's reality, and there is a very thin line. And of course, I wanted to discuss more about talk more about religion in this regard, because is religion fantasy or is it reality? Because there's no photographic evidence, no video evidence, no other type of physical, material, tangible evidence, no scientific evidence for the existence of God or angels or demons or any of this type of stuff that gets mentioned in a lot of the holy scriptures and texts around the world. So is religion fantasy? Is religion just all made up and fantasy and nonsense? Is religion just fantasy and nonsense? That's obviously this is very controversial and people have their own opinions, but but you have to understand, there's no photographic evidence, no video evidence, no other tangible material evidence for the existence of God or angels or demons or anything else that's mentioned in a lot of the holy texts, holy scriptures for a lot of the different world religions. So is religion fantasy or is it reality? And this is very controversial, and people have their own types of understandings and interpretations. I mean, I'm not gonna I can't really discuss their understandings and interpretations. A lot of people will just say, well, I don't know, is they're real. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not real. I don't know. This is something to help you think. I don't know. Just because you can't see them, they're not real. It's kind of, obviously that's a very stupid type of argument that might be used by a lot of different people and stuff. It's a very stupid type of argument that might be used by a lot of different people and stuff. Gotta be very careful. It's a very stupid argument. Just because you can't see it when they're not real, is that very valid? I don't know. Is that valid? I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to discuss this in a proper way. Is that valid? Is that valid? Is that a very type of, like a lot of people say would kind of think like this, oh, just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not real. Obviously not, maybe, I don't know, maybe not a lot of people might not use this argument, but is that a very valid argument? Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not real. I don't know. Again, God, religion is such a very controversial to discuss religion in this regard, but religion, is religion just fantasy and nonsense? Because we don't have any photographic evidence for God, we don't have any video evidence of God, we don't have any type of we don't even have any other type of physical, material, tangible evidence for God. So is God, obviously, you can see how God in this regard would kind of just be, God would be very similar to, in terms of like being real, it would be very similar to like an imaginary dragon that we see in a lot of different movies and cartoons. Dragons are not physically real, they haven't been proven to be real in any meaningful way. So, dragons, obviously there might be, some people might argue there's like a slight difference between dragons and the existence of God and angels and demons, obviously, but you can see how in this regard, right, there's no photographic video evidence or any other type of meaningful, material, tangible evidence for either God or dragons or demons or angels and stuff like this. So fantasy is religion, just all fantasy and nonsense. Obviously it's very difficult to discuss this, and there's a lot of things that you have to think about, but I don't know. Again, fantasy versus reality, you gotta know the difference between what's real and what's not real, what's real and what's just imaginary and fake and just made up nonsense. This difference is so important to understand. You have to understand this type of difference. You gotta make sure you're cognizant of this difference and stuff. You gotta know the difference between fantasy and reality. Make sure you're not being delusional. You're not looking at things in the wrong way. You're not just like believing in things that aren't real. You're not just believing in just nonsense. Obviously, belief, the power of belief is so powerful. What you believe can literally can change your life. Let's just say that you believed that like doing exercise would shorten your life. Imagine if that's the type of belief you had, you wouldn't do exercise. So it would be kind of ironic then your life would be shorter because you wouldn't be doing exercise, because you think that would be shortening your life. But obviously we know that exercise is very good for us. It actually lengthens our life. It actually makes us live longer lives, healthier lives. So the power of belief, what you believe, is so powerful and important. A lot of people don't understand this. Like, what you believe, it can literally impact your entire life. Your belief, how you see the world, what you believe and stuff like this, it can literally impact your entire life. Let's just say you believe that exercise shortens your life. You wouldn't do exercise as frequently, and so what happens, ironically, your life gets shorter because you're not exercising as much, because you believe that exercise shortens your life. But in reality, it would be it would lengthen your life. It would make you live longer. This is so important. What you believe, it has a massive impact. What you believe has a massive impact on your life, on your worldview, on your reality, and on your life. Obviously, your beliefs are very powerful. So if you believe God is real, stuff like this, that's obviously that might benefit you in a lot of different positive ways. You might be more relaxed and chilled out because you think someone's looking after you and stuff like this. I don't know, but what you believe is very powerful. You need to also look into the placebo effect. That's so important to understand. The placebo effect is it's also very, very powerful. Your belief, like, that's what the placebo effect is. Let's just say you have this bottle of pills and stuff, and this bottle of pills, obviously these bottle of pills, they don't have any real medicine in them. They're just filled with like white tacks, I don't know, and you eat these white tacks, but you think they're actual real medicine, and you think that you're going to get better by eating these white tacks. And so you know, this is very bizarre. Your belief actually works, because the placebo effect is just your belief, like what you believe and stuff. And if you believe, like, let's say in this hypothetical example, there's like a bottle of white tacks. They're not real medicine. There's like these white tacks, white things that you consume, but there's no real medicine in them, but you take them anyway. You think they're real, and they're real medicine. You just believe that they're real medicine. You know, it's very weird. Your body, you would actually start to experience some sort of health benefits from this, just because of the fact that you believe that that's real medicine. That's weird, and it'll be just as effective as taking real medicine, real actual medicine. Like the placebo effect, the power of belief is so important to understand. Like what you believe is very, very important. Obviously, just because you believe something is real doesn't mean it's going to be actually real. You know, you can believe in elves and elves, trolls, and dragons and stuff like this. Obviously, it doesn't matter how hard you believe in this. It's not gonna. You'll never make elves, dragons, and stuff like that real. Obviously, I mean, you could like engineer them to be real. You can make like mannequins and stuff like this. I don't know, but you won't make them like naturally real. You know, I mean, they're not just gonna start to come into existence just because you believe in them. So yeah, you know, the power of belief is so important, and it relates obviously to what's fantasy and what's reality, because what you believe is very important, and you have to. And that's why I said that you need to understand the difference between fantasy and reality. Fantasy is basically just the imagination, just figments of the human mind. You know, things that aren't reflecting reality in the real life world. That's what fantasy is. Reality is kind of like reality is what's real, what's in this physical material world. That's the difference that you have to understand. It's very tricky, man. Look, it's very, very tricky, man. A lot of people get duped, and and tricked into believing in things that aren't even real. It's so weird. It's so bizarre to me. I don't know. That's why you gotta be very, 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 very careful in this regard. You cannot believe in fantasy, and obviously you have to stick to the real life world and stick to the real life facts. You have to be sort of like a scientist. You have to be able to look at things objectively and clearly and make sure your mind's not being tricked and stuff. That's so important. Do you want it? You have to be very, very careful in this regard. You have to make sure your mind isn't being tricked by fantasy and delusions. This is so important. It's very difficult as well. You have to make sure you're not being tricked by fantasies. Your mind isn't being tricked by things that aren't real. Your mind isn't being tricked by things that aren't real. You have to be very, very careful in this regard. You have to be careful and make sure you're not being tricked by things that aren't real. That's so important. Fantasy versus reality. That is so important. You gotta be very, very careful in this regard. You gotta make sure you're not being tricked by things that aren't real. Your mind isn't being tricked. You're not believing in things that aren't real. And it's very difficult. It's very tricky. You gotta make sure your head's on straight and properly and stuff. You're not just being tricked and deluded. So it's very difficult though, because there's a thin line between what's fantasy and what's reality. There's a very thin line, and it's and you need to kind of sharpen your critical thinking skills. You gotta make sure you're not being deluded. You gotta sort of become a scientist. You gotta understand the scientific method and stuff. You gotta make sure you're sharpening your intellectual faculties. You gotta understand what's real, what's just nonsense and fake and bullshit. This is so important. This is so important. You know, like when I'm recording outside, I'm a little bit worried. I just believe that someone might come on to me and stuff and start ticking and maybe try breaking my camera. I just gotta be so careful about this. Usually when someone comes up to me and just asks me what I'm doing, I reply, I'm just talking to someone on the phone, because I'm using a GoPro, so it's small and stuff like that, you know. I can just cover it up a little bit, and I'll just say, I'm talking to someone on the phone, and a lot of the times people just believe that nonsense. I don't know. If you want to be like a YouTuber or a vlogger, and you want to record outside, you gotta be very, very careful, man. A lot of people can cause you a lot of problems and trouble, so you got to be very careful in this regard, and you got to make sure you're very aware of who's coming by and stuff like this. So anyway, that's kind of a side tangent, but bringing it back to fantasy versus reality. What's real, what's fake? Movies are obviously, we know that movies are just like, they're just like, basically, it's kind of weird because movies, the people are real. The actors are actually real people, but they're playing fake characters, and that's kind of very interesting. It's like fantasy and reality are kind of coming together in this regard, right? In terms of like movies and stuff like that. Movies, the actors are real people, but they're playing fake characters. So in fantasy versus reality, it can get mixed up. There's a lot of the times it can just get mixed up. Shoot, it's cold as hell outside, man. Fantasy versus reality. Movie actors are real, but they're playing fake characters. So it's very fantasy versus reality. It's very tricky to kind of nail this down, and there's no clear answers to any of this. There's no clear answers to any of this and stuff. You gotta make sure you're kind of vigilant and stuff like that. You gotta make sure you're vigilant and aware and stuff like that. And you're not getting tricked. You're not getting tricked and duped. Your mind isn't getting tricked. That's what I'm saying, man. It's so difficult though, man. So many people believe in a lot of different things that are very suspect and questionable. Obviously religion is very questionable. Helicopter. So many people, they believe in things that are very questionable, you know what I mean? Obviously, people that have schizophrenia, that have a lot of different types of mental illnesses and stuff, they believe in things that are probably just, obviously not real, but they believe it's real, and that's kind of very interesting. Fantasy versus reality, if they believe it's real, is it real? That's very important to think about. It's just because you believe in something, does that make it real? I don't know. Let's say you genuinely believed in like dragons and trolls and demons, and your brain just kind of, and let's say you had schizophrenia, so you just start seeing them up in the air and stuff like this. Yeah, some other type of mental illness that made you see them anyway. Are dragons real then? That's very interesting. Because let's just say you have some type of mental illness that makes you see dragons in real life. Would they be real in this type of way? I don't know. This is very interesting now, right? Damn, that helicopter, the noise fucking hits my ears, man. Freaking hits my ears. The noise literally cuts, it hits my ears, it smacks my ears and stuff. Damn. Fantasy versus reality is so important that you understand this type of difference. That you understand this type of difference. That you understand the difference between fantasy and reality and stuff like this. Just because you believe something is real, does that make it real? Let's just say, dragons and stuff were flying around. Imagine some guy had mental illness, he just saw dragons, even though they're not real. Even though they're not real. Let's just say he saw dragons and stuff. He saw dragons even though they're not real. He saw dragons and stuff even though they're not real because of his mental illness. Would that make dragons real? That's very interesting and stuff. Would that mean that dragons are somehow real? I don't know. It's very interesting to think about. Let's just say that, this guy, he actually started to see dragons because of some type of mental illness. Would that mean that dragons are real in his case? I don't know. It's very interesting. Fantasy versus reality. The lines can get blurred very quickly and stuff, and it's very difficult sometimes to know the difference between what's fantasy and what's reality. Oh man, recording outside again is so chilly out, especially in England and stuff. But it's kind of, I don't know, I just like recording videos outside. It's more interesting. Fantasy versus reality. Let's say this guy had mental illness, so he believed, I don't know, that he saw, he's in his mind, and in his brain, he actually started to see real life dragons just because of this mental illness. He just started, I don't know, he just his brain just made it up for him and stuff, and he actually was starting to see real life dragons and stuff. In his case, would dragons be real? It's fantasy versus reality is so important to understand the difference. Well, obviously the lines can get blurred so easily and stuff. Obviously, this is gonna be all, do you know what solipsism is? That's how do you know that anything is even actually real? It's not just your brain isn't just imagining everything. Your brain isn't just kind of making everything up. Obviously, you know, we can never truly know that the world around us is actually real. It's just our brain. We can never know if it's just our brain playing tricks on us. You don't know in this type of way. Like your eyeballs might just be kind of playing tricks on you. You don't know that. This is kind of very scary to think about. But I don't know. Fantasy versus reality. The lines can get blurred a lot. But let's just assume that your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. Your eyeballs are actually, they're like camera lenses. They're actually showing you the real life world. I don't know. They're not just playing tricks on you. I don't know. But obviously, you'll never know for sure if your eyeballs aren't just playing tricks on you. Damn, it's very scary, man, to think about this. It's very scary to think about this, right? That your entire world could just be a figment of your imagination. I don't know. This entire world we have, your brain might just be imagining it and stuff. It's not actually real and stuff in that way. This is tricky, man. Very tricky and stuff. Fantasy versus reality. The lines can get blurred so easily. The lines can get blurred so easily and stuff. Damn, I don't know what to say, man. Fantasy versus reality. The lines can get blurred so easily. It is possible that, you know, our sensory organs are just playing tricks on us, right? Our eyeballs, our ears, our nose and stuff like this. It's playing tricks on us. So it's our brain playing tricks on us. So brain playing tricks on us and stuff. It's our brain playing tricks on us and stuff like that. It's very difficult to understand this. Very difficult to kind of know what's real and what's fake. Man, it's so tricky to know the difference between what's real and what's fake. To know the difference between what's real and what's fake and stuff like this. To know the difference between what's real and what's fake is so difficult, man. And the lines can get blurred so easily and stuff. It's up to you though, obviously, to kind of do your own kind of investigations and stuff. I don't know, but you gotta know what's real and what's fake. That's so important. What's fantasy and what's reality. It's so important that you can make out this difference. It's very important. It's very important that you can make out this difference between what's fantasy and what's reality. Oh, it's freaking chilly, man. It's very cold, man, I swear. Damn. It's very cold as well. It's cold as hell, man, I swear. Fantasy versus reality. You gotta know the difference, man. You cannot believe in things that aren't real. But obviously the lines can get blurred so easily, and so it's kind of very tricky for me to even discuss this properly. Fantasy versus reality. What's real, what's fake? I discussed movies a little bit earlier, right? The movie actors, they're real people, but they're playing fake characters, and not very interesting. You know, it's kind of, so like our movies, like obviously they're fantasies. Because the story, the plot structure and the plot lines aren't reflecting the real world. There's like, you know, these movie actors, the characters they're playing, they're not actually real people. Even though the movie actors are real. So, okay, so you can see fantasy versus reality. The lines can get blurred so easily. The lines can get blurred so easily, right? How do we know that our eyeballs and our other sensory organs aren't just playing tricks on us, right? This entire world that we have and that we experience, it could just all just be a part of our imagination. It's so difficult to kind of understand this properly, man. But, you know, fantasy versus reality. You know, dragons, I mentioned them a way earlier, right? But dragons, you know, we don't, like, there's no, like, you don't go on National Geographic and you don't see, like, documentaries on how dragons are like in the African savannah and how they're real and they're flying around and stuff, and what their life cycle is like and stuff like this, because dragons are not real creatures. They're not natural creatures. They're things that we just kind of pulled from our imagination. So it's kind of That's interesting to think about. The dragons are kind of things that we just pulled from our imagination. They're not real at all in any meaningful way. There's so many different things that we just pulled from our imagination. You know, it's kind of very interesting. Cars, you know, like a lot of the things that cars are kind of, we just kind of pulled cars, smartphones, all of the technology we have, it came from our imagination. Technology is not natural, it comes from the human mind, the human brain. Like, we engineered cars and planes and helicopters and all this stuff, roads, societies, computers, PlayStations, Xboxes, all of this stuff was pulled from our imagination. That's so, you know, fantasy versus reality. Fantasies can sometimes become a reality, right? Some type of person, he kind of invented he started to think up of the like the initial design for the first car and stuff like that, and then cars, like, because of this, I don't know, maybe it was a group of different people, I don't know, that were responsible for the invention of the car. But you know, cars are not natural. All the technology we have isn't natural. It's stuff that we invented, we pulled from our imagination. We literally imagined stuff up in our heads and we brought it into real life. That's so magical. So, you know, fantasy versus reality. Sometimes our fantasies can become reality, and that's so magical. So many different things, like look at all of the different human inventions. All of our inventions are not natural. They were made up by us. We invented so many different things, and we pulled these different things from our imagination. That's so magical. That is so magical. You know, fantasy versus reality. Sometimes, you know, fantasy can become a reality, right? You know, all of our inventions were pulled from our imagination. They didn't just exist naturally, right? That's so weird. So, you know, I mentioned dragons earlier. Imagine, like, sometime in the future, our technology becomes so sophisticated, right, that we can just engineer dragons to be real life organic creatures and stuff, and they become real and stuff like that, you know. So fantasy versus reality. Sometimes fantasy can become reality, right? You know, because of the human brain and stuff like that. Fantasy can become reality and stuff, and that's kind of very interesting. It's very interesting and stuff. Fantasy can become reality because of the human brain and stuff. Because we can literally bring things into we can pull things from our imagination and bring them into real life. That's so weird. That's so magical and stuff. That fantasy can become reality. Fantasy can become reality and stuff like this. That's so weird, man. It's so weird and stuff. That we can pull things from our imagination and they can come into real life. You're right, old man. You're right. Joel, man, where are you going, man? That we can pull things from our imagination and they can become real. That's so, it's very interesting. That's so interesting that like look at all of the different all of the different inventions that we humans made. You know, dragons, I mentioned them earlier. Imagine, like, in sometime in the future, our technology becomes so sophisticated that we can actually start to engineer and construct and build like real organic life forms. Like, we can make dragons real. We can just engineer them and they'll become real. That's so weird. That's very magical. That would be very. That's what's so magical about the human being. We can pull things from our imagination and make them real. So, you know, fantasy versus reality. Sometimes fantasy can become reality. You know, I mentioned dragons. Obviously, they're not real. They're not. But you know, who's to say, like, sometime in the future, if our technology becomes advanced enough, who's to say that dragons cannot be real? We cannot just manufacture them and turn them into real life organic creatures. I don't know. It would just depend on, like, how advanced our technology is. It would just depend on how advanced our technology is. Who's to say dragons cannot become real sometime in the future if we develop the right technology? So important. So important. Because sometimes fantasy can become reality and stuff. We can pull things from our imagination and they can become real. That's so magical. Only the human being is capable of this. I don't believe any other animals is even capable of this, or any other type of creature that's on this planet. Only the human being can do this, right? We can pull things from our imagination and make them real. That's so magical. Fantasy can actually become reality. Again, I mentioned dragons. Again, who's to say sometime in the future, if our technology becomes sophisticated enough, who's to say that dragons cannot be real? They might. There's a big likelihood that dragons can actually become real if we develop the technology to manufacture biological organisms and creatures and stuff like this. If our technology becomes sophisticated enough to the point where we can just manufacture these types of biological creatures and entities, that's so interesting to think about. Fantasy. Who's to say, right? That fantasy cannot become reality, right? Any look at all of our inventions. They always were pulled from our imagination. So fantasy versus reality, the lines can get blurred. But you need to understand what's real and what's fake. Obviously, again, but we humans, we can bring our fantasies into reality, and that's kind of very magical. I don't know. But obviously, there is still a physical, material world. Just because you believe in let's just say trolls, demons, angels, God, I don't know, dragons and stuff like this, doesn't mean it's actually real and stuff. You have to understand that type of difference between what's fantasy and what's reality. Obviously there's a lot of, obviously we humans, we can bring fantasy into reality and stuff, obviously, but still there still are boundaries and limits and stuff. We can't you can't imagine just because you believe that, I don't know, unicorns are real. You can't just, they're real. Obviously you can kind of get a horse and put a thing on its head and now unicorns are real. Obviously you can do that, but unicorns aren't naturally real on their own. It's fantasy versus reality. Some things are just not real and stuff, and just because you believe in them doesn't make them real. It's important to understand the difference between what's fantasy, what's fantasy and what's reality, or what's real and what's fake. It's so important that you understand this type of difference. You understand this difference between what's fantasy, fake, and what's reality, real. You gotta understand this difference. You gotta not make sure you're not being tricked. Your mind isn't being tricked. Your other sensory organs aren't being tricked and stuff like this. You're not just believing in nonsense. You gotta make sure your brain isn't being tricked. You gotta make sure you're not being deluded by fantasies. Obviously, well, again, I mentioned that the lines can get blurred, and we humans, we can make our fantasies, we can bring them into reality. I mean, look at all of our inventions. They were just pulled from our imagination. It's very magical. The human being, we can just pull things from our imagination and make them real, but there's still boundaries and limits and stuff like this. You can't just believe in something and make it real. Obviously that's not gonna happen. You can't just make yourself grow angel wings. Imagine, I'm here, right? Imagine if I just believed that, I believe that I have wings, angel wings. Obviously I'm not gonna get angel wings just because I believe that I have angel wings. It's ridiculous nonsense. But still, it's very magical that we humans can just pull things from our imagination and make them real. That is so magical. We can make our fantasies real just because we can engineer them and stuff like this and make them real in that way, just through our creativity and stuff and our crafting skills and stuff. It's very magical. But still, fantasy versus reality, there are boundaries and stuff like this and limits. Just because you believe in something doesn't mean it's going to be real. Just because you believe you can fly. Isn't there a song about this? I believe I can fly. I'm gonna have to do some research on this. Just because you believe, imagine, just because you believe that you can fly, and let's say you were on top of some type of tall tower and stuff, and you said to yourself, you believe you can fly, all right, and then I don't know what happens after. I guess you try jumping off. We both know your legs are just going to get broken and you're going to die. Just because you believe in something doesn't make it real, right? You believe you can fly, but you go to the top of a tower and you jump off, and you just fall to your death. Just because you believed, let's just say, the placebo effect isn't going to help you here. Let's just say you go to the top of some type of tower and you believe that you can fly and stuff, and you jump off. Obviously, we both know that you're just going to break your legs and die. You're not going to fly. So, fantasy versus reality, you're going to know what's real and what's fake, what's fantasy, imagination stuff, things that aren't real. And you're going to know what's reality, things that are actually real, things that are part of this physical material world. Again, let's just say you believe you can fly, so you climb to the top of some tower. the placebo effect isn't going to help you here. Just because you believe you can fly doesn't mean that you're actually going to be able to fly. Obviously, you're going to jump off that tower and you're going to break your legs and die. Your belief can only take you so far. The placebo effect isn't going to help you here. Let's just actually say when you go to the top of a tower and you say, I believe I can fly, and you play that song as well, and you jump off the tower. Just because you believe you can fly doesn't mean you're actually going to fly, right? The placebo effect won't help you there. Fantasy versus reality, you got to understand the difference.